Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. There's still a few people who are joining, so we'll keep on letting people in. But we'll get started. So I'm Hannah Randall. I'm Head of Learning at Holocaust Centre North, and tonight we are joined by our Head of Research, Dr. Chelsea Sambles. And our speaker tonight is Sasha Goldstein-Sabbah. So a few technical things to mention before we start. If you have any questions throughout the talk, please put them in the chat box and then we'll get to as many as possible. The talk will be between 40 to 45 minutes, so we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end, and we will aim to finish promptly at 6 o'clock. So we are, as you're aware, recording tonight's event, and early next week you will receive a link for the recording and also a short online survey, so any feedback you can give us we are very appreciative of. But before I hand over to Sasha, I'll formally introduce her. So Sasha is Assistant Professor of Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. She is specialised in the modern history of Middle Eastern and North African Jews, and her research considers how disparate Jewish communities interacted with one another through philanthropic, business, and religious networks. She's the author of numerous scholarly and trade publications, including her recent monograph, Baghdadi Jewish Networks in the Age of Nationalism, which was published in 2021. So that's enough from me, and I will hand over to Sasha. Thank you, Sasha.
Okay, well, Hannah and Chelsea, thank you so much for having me. I'm just going to share my PowerPoint. Okay, one sec. Okay, so as Hannah said, I'm going to speak. It will probably be around 40 minutes, maybe less, and then you can ask me any questions you would like about the history of Iraqi Jews. I am going to talk about the Farhud. If you don't know what that is, we will build up to it. But I think that if we're going to talk about the Farhud, it's really important to talk about Iraqi Jewish history a bit, right? And it's important to even kind of talk about the history and legacy of Jews in the Islamic world, because it would be really unfortunate to reduce their history to one violent event in 1941. But first, maybe a little bit about who I am. As Hannah said, I am an assistant professor in Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Groningen. And my research is really on the modern, so 19th and early 20th century history of Jews in the Arabic-speaking, primarily, world. And I think about things like contemporary questions of Jewish identity, modernity, how does this change these communities, diaspora studies, so how did Jewish networks function in this period before the creation of the State of Israel? And then because, of course, I work on Jews who live in the Islamic world, how does this relate to Jewish-Muslim relations historically, at the least? And that's kind of what I do in terms of research. So I don't work on the Holocaust. I don't specifically work on the Farhud, but it is an important moment in Iraqi Jewish history. And of course, I've read much archival material about it. And I think it offers some interesting points of reflection on Iraqi Jewish history. But before I start, I'm going to make an assumption that some people listening to me don't have a lot of background in the history of Jews in the Islamic world. And so first, I'm going to make a shameless pitch that if you are interested in both the history of the Middle East or in Jewish history, it's really important to think about the long and vibrant history of Jews in the Islamic world and not reduce it to kind of the exodus of these communities. And this is a problem, I think, both in Middle Eastern history groups and in Jewish history groups, right? At universities, for example, is that these communities continue to be marginalized. And as a visualization of this picture was taken by an artist, Meir Gal, and this is actually him in 1977 holding up 9 pages of the main Israeli history textbook. And those are the 9 pages that talk about Jews in the Islamic world after 1492. And as a point of comparison, American Jewish history in that same textbook got 14 pages. And that, in my mind, as a historian, is a travesty. So whenever I speak, I really just want to elevate the history of these communities, and I hope motivate people to learn more about them in general. So where I want to start off again very broadly is that when we think about Jewish communities in the Islamic world, and I know she's thinking how she can get to the Farhud from here, but I think building this up is really important. Jews represent historic Jewish communities across the Middle East and North Africa, communities that often predate the advent of Islam in those places. And I'm talking about today, the countries from Morocco all the way to Iran, what is today Turkey, down to Yemen. And as such, Islam and Judaism will actually very much develop together theologically, but also kind of in this Islamicate cultural space. And in some places, you also have Christian communities, more so in the Levant and in Iraq, and less so in North Africa. And so that means if we look at Jewish and Muslim cultures in the Middle East and North Africa in the late 19th or early 20th century, there are lots of points of cultural convergence, right? Musical tastes, for example, the way people dress, ideas about modesty and social mores, literary styles, art, food, certainly, and language. Jews in the Middle East and North Africa, especially before imperial expansion, primarily speak Arabic, right? And in some communities, Jews speak a dialect which is distinguishable from a communal sense. And in other places, the dialect of Arabic they speak is more or less the same as the dialect of the larger population. In Iraq, that is one place where Jews spoke a very specific Amiya, a very specific dialect, which was distinguishable from both the Muslim and the Christian communities. There's a lot of great research on this. But what's interesting is if we analyze that dialect in, let's say, 1900, and then we analyze it again in 1945, the differences become less pronounced. And so from kind of a sociolinguistic perspective, that actually speaks to more interaction, right? More people speaking together. And then also, of course, the advent of radio will change language in that. So we need to not think about Jews as a fifth column, especially in the first half of the 20th century, but really as part of, in this case, I'm talking about Iraqi society, of course, but part of Iraqi society. And the same can be said for a place like Egypt. And of course, each Jewish community of the Middle East and North Africa is different. And I don't want to lump them together without acknowledging those differences. But this idea that they are part of wider cultures is something that is certainly shared across the region. And because people sometimes want some numbers, so these are kind of the numbers of these communities around the creation of the State of Israel. Most of them are taken from Sergio Della Pergola. If you know who he is, he's a demographer at the Hebrew University. The numbers for Morocco are slightly higher because we have some new information that's come in. But if you look at this, certainly Morocco has the largest Jewish population, mid-20th century. And then after that, you have Iraq and Algeria, which have more or less comparable sized communities. So now honing in to Iraqi Jewry. And I think there's some people listening from this community, so I'm sorry if I'm saying things you already know. But the Jewish community of Iraq historically was very much viewed as being this historic community, right, within Iraq, tracing its origins to the Babylonian exile, kind of the original Jewish diaspora community, and then having relevance within Jewish, religious development. This is where the Babylonian Talmud is written. It's where Saadia Gaon kind of directs all of the Jewish communities around the Middle East and North Africa, right? Saadia Gaon will write to the Jewish community in Al-Andalus, telling them how to celebrate Pesach. And so there is this long history. Iraq is a place where there are pilgrimage sites. So it's seen as being part of Jewish history, but also being part of what will become Iraqi history, right? Iraq is part of the Ottoman Empire, and the Iraqi state is only formed after World War I, with the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire. And so you have three provinces, Basra, Mosul, and Baghdad, and those three former Ottoman provinces become the Iraqi state. And you have Jews who are present in all three provinces. The majority of the Jewish community is urban, centered in Baghdad, with smaller communities in Basra and Mosul. And then you have, in this new Iraqi state, a community in the north. So in the province of Mosul, if you've ever heard of Kurdish Jews, I don't like to call them that because they actually speak Neo-Aramaic. And that is a community which linguistically and culturally is a little bit separate from the wider Baghdadi community. And so you have this long established community, and it's part of Iraqi society. And it's also very much part of transnational Jewish networks, which is something I usually write more about. And just to give you an idea, the Alliance Israélite Universelle, I don't know if people listening have heard of it, but it's a transnational Jewish philanthropic organization founded in 1860, and they will open schools across the Middle East and North Africa. They'll actually open their second school after the school in Tetouan, Morocco. They'll open their second school in Baghdad in 1864. And I think that's really a testament to both how connected Iraqi Jews are to other Jewish communities, even in the 19th century, and also how their path to modernity goes about. You know, this school is actually the first school to teach secular subjects in Iraq, to such an extent that in the beginning, when there weren't any secular schools for the Muslim community, some Muslim and Christian notables would actually send their children to these schools to study secular subjects. Then, as I said, it's part of the Ottoman provinces. The Ottoman Empire is no longer. Iraq becomes a state under British mandate. So I know most people think about the mandate in Palestine, but the British mandate is an idea that Iraq will become an independent state, and that Britain and British imperialism will help them do this. Obviously, Britain is motivated by the connection to India, trade interests, at a later stage, oil interests, not quite in this period. But unlike anywhere else in the Arabic-speaking world, with the 1924 Constitution, all Jews will be granted citizenship in Iraq, and Jews will have parliamentary representation. So this will happen nowhere else. And that, I think, is a very important example of how integrated Jews are into Iraqi society. Also, there's a very important Jewish school network, which is attached to the Alliance Israélite Universelle, and also to the Anglo-Jewish Association, for those of you who might be aware of that, some of their schools. But by 1928, the school district actually comes under management of the local Jewish community. And I think that's just an example to see how established the Jewish communal leadership is. They even in the 1930s will partner with the Ministry of Education, and they'll have these kind of hybrid schools, which are technically state schools, but it's the Jewish community either providing the teachers' salaries in some cases, or providing the buildings. So it's a highly educated community, and this high level of education doesn't just come from the Jewish community, but also kind of comes from its partnership with the state. But also numerically, the Jewish community of Baghdad is significant. In the 1920s, it represents about 25% of the city of Baghdad, which I find remarkable. Now, in terms of the percentage, this will actually decline in the 30s and 40s. And the reason for this is that there's tremendous migration to Iraq. In Iraq, there's tremendous migration from rural areas to urban centers. So it's not that the Jewish community is declining. The birth rates might be slightly less than the larger population, but it's mostly has to do with immigration and just the growth of Baghdad as a city. But because of this very high level of education, particularly before the wider state school system develops, Jews are overly represented in the middle class, in the civil service, and also kind of amongst the commercial elites. So this is a prominent community who is connected to transnational Jewish networks, and who is also very much part of a wider Iraqi society, and kind of members of the Jewish community are part of the intellectual class who is thinking about what this new pluralist Iraqi state should look like. The 1920s and 30s are very much a period where the Jewish community enjoys great socioeconomic mobility, right? Because of this expansion, because of this need to build a civil service and their high level of education. It's also a period where there's additional integration into general Iraqi society. So what do I mean by that? Well, prior to this, although Jews would speak Arabic, they would write in Judeo-Arabic, which is writing the Arabic language in Hebrew script, right? So it's like transliterated. It's very difficult to read, actually. But with the Jewish school system, there's a transition, and it's a transition we don't really see anywhere else at the same level, where Jews stop writing in Judeo-Arabic and they begin to write in modern standard Arabic. And this is really significant as kind of this wider integration into the larger society. They're active in the public sphere. So I mean, intellectuals are writing op-eds in newspapers, both Jewish communal newspapers, but also more general newspapers. And they're very important for creating culture, philosophy, art, music, architecture. The first Iraqi film, the script is written by a Jewish intellectual. The main music school in Baghdad, the main teachers are the Kuwaiti brothers, who is a pair of Baghdadi Jews. And the 20s are seen as kind of a golden age, if you will. But with the mandate ending in the 1930s and the death of Faisal, who's the first king of Iraq, who's seen as being very close to the Jewish community, coupled with this political uncertainty, we have to remember that now we're in the Great Depression. So there's also economic security. The Jewish community feels more uneasy, and rioting, in Mandate Palestine, that also kind of complicates things. But overall, the community is in good stead. And so we can talk about an unease, but it's not equivalent to, Germany post 1933 in any way, shape, or form. There's some unease, but the community really continues to flourish. In parallel to this, you have a Baghdadi diaspora beginning actually as early as the 18th century, and you have this important diaspora in India, and then from India it will expand to East Asia. And why is this important? It's important because it kind of further globalizes and internationalizes the Baghdadi Jewish community. It makes them closer to Britain. And of course, in this period, British imperialism is very important in Iraq as well. And it offers new channels of information. It also makes the community wealthier, because a lot of wealthy Jews, sometimes now about like Sassoons and Kadoories, remit funds to Baghdad, and that helps underwrite this very robust infrastructure, which the community runs. It also complicates things as we get into the 1930s. There's more anti-colonial sentiment, and certain sectors, particularly the Jewish elite, are seen as being close, or perhaps even too close, to colonial officials. This community, as I said, they're active in these transnational networks. So you have this bridge between Europe and Iraq, which comes through these communities on the Indian subcontinent and in East Asia. You have this important philanthropic network that I mentioned with the Alliance and the Anglo-Jewish organization. And then you even have Iraqi rabbis who are in contact with rabbis in places like London and New York. And the Jews in Baghdad have access to kind of a global media space. So both kind of a non-Jewish global media space, the Manchester Guardian, the New York Times, but also a Jewish media space, having access to the Jewish Chronicle, for example, because you're in the UK. That is a newspaper that was very well read in Iraq, and Baghdadi Jews, both living in Iraq or living outside of Iraq, would also write in that newspaper. So why am I saying this? It's to say that Iraqi Jewry feels both connected to Iraqi society and to global Jewry in the 1930s. And that means that they're also aware of what is going on in Europe in the lead up to World War II, right? Because they are reading the reporting in the Jewish and the general press. They have informal reports coming in by family and relations in Europe. It's a very important merchant class in Baghdad, and so they import European goods. They're aware of the hardships that German and then after 38 Austrian Jewry is experiencing, for example. And as early as 1933, they're getting resettlement requests from German Jewry, right? So we're talking about doctors, surgeons, dentists, and they don't have an infrastructure to handle this. They're relatively unsuccessful, although they do try due to political concerns of the state. The Iraqi state doesn't open up visas to Jewish refugees from Europe. The kind of global Baghdadi diaspora is successful in helping out some Jewish refugees from Europe who come to India. And then at a later date, of course, the Shanghai ghetto is very much financed by Iraqi Jewry in collaboration with the JDC. But the local Baghdadi community will also spearhead boycotting German goods, for example. And they will try to allocate some of their communal funds to helping European Jewish refugees. So all of this to say they are aware of what is going on in Europe. Now, what is the Farhud and how does it happen, right? There's this tension in Iraq. It's a British mandate. And you have some sectors of the population who are more pro-British, and you have some sectors of the population who are less pro-British or anti-colonial. And the Jewish communal elite is seen as being close, rightfully so, to the British colonial forces. And in the late 30s and early 40s, this is a time of general political instability because of these questions of decolonization and the rise of Arab nationalism in Iraq. And in April of 1941, Rashid Ali, who is anti-British and pro-German, he stages a successful government coup in Iraq. And this is of tremendous concern to the Jewish population, who is aware of what is going on in Germany. The German army does not send many troops to Iraq. It's not very serious, let's say, the invasion. It's just a moment of stress for the community, and there are some rumors that there could be some anti-Jewish violence. The British army will organize itself with the regent. So you still have a regent in Iraq who is considered to be pro-British. They will begin to organize British army units in Basra around April 19th. So Basra's in the south, they're coming from India, right? Building up to kind of retaking Iraq in the context of World War II, Iraqi troops loyal to the British enter Iraqi cities to retake the government from the pro-German troops and government of Rashid Ali. In early June, coinciding with Shavuot of 1941, as a consequence of this reaffirmation of the pro-British sector within Iraqi politics, plus the British army now once again entrenched in Iraq, there is an anti-Jewish riot or a pogrom, if you will, which is considered a major breakdown in the Iraqi state. The British and Iraqi forces don't protect Jews, and those who attack the Jewish community are primarily policemen, government officials who are protesting the reaffirmation of British or pro-British power in Iraq, and they're focusing on the Jewish community kind of because they're seen as this pro-British sector of society. So it's 2 days of violence mostly in Iraq. We don't know the amount of deaths. I used to say it was between 130 and 180 deaths. Some numbers go as high as 6,000. The truth is, the more I look at it and the more I think about it, we won't know. And there's conflicting archival evidence to this, but there's also this idea that, as I will get to in the next slide, this is an embarrassment both to the Jewish community, who very much saw themselves as part of a wider Iraqi society. It is also an embarrassment to the Iraqi government. And so it has been suggested that actually both the Jewish community and the Iraqi government would want to have diminished the amount of deaths. Also, we don't know who died of injuries afterwards. So these numbers are very, very difficult to ascertain. There's a huge difference between 130 or 600 people. I'm not arguing for one or the other. I'm simply saying that we don't know. Thousands of Jews are injured, and there are billions of dollars to Jewish property and looting. So it starts out as really being violence, and then there's looting. There are thoughts that people came from the countryside and began to loot Jewish businesses and homes. So that's what happens. And after these 2 days, the government reaffirms order. But now let's look at what happens. And it's been argued, and I agree with her, by the historian Ori Bashkin, that in some ways the Farhud is really a microcosm for the best and the worst of the Iraqi Jewish experience. Many Jews survive and their homes are not attacked because their Muslim neighbors protect them. And this kind of harkens back to what I was saying about how much Jews were part of the society. But of course, there are other stories which are not as positive or kind of in a gray space. So, for example, I wrote here bride, which should be bribe. Some Jews bribe Muslims, policemen, for example, to protect them. But also, it's important to note that Jews who live in mixed neighborhoods, so kind of these middle-class neighborhoods on the outside of Iraq, on the outside of Baghdad, like Bustan al-Khas, if anyone here really knows Baghdad, from this period, those areas aren't attacked because people don't know how to differentiate from a Jewish home compared to a Muslim or a Christian home. So while this is an anti-violent Jewish act, it's very much focused on certain historic Jewish neighborhoods. Sometimes people ask, well, why didn't all the Jews leave Iraq after this horrible, terrible event? And there are a couple of reasons for this. So one is, we have to remember we're in 1941, right? So if you think about where European Jewry is, it's much, much worse than even in Iraq. Also, there's nowhere for them to go. There are many requests to get transit visas to the Indian subcontinent. These are denied by the British. And no one is going to Europe, no one is going to Britain, and the United States has more or less closed off all of its immigration at this point as well, as we know, because European Jewry can't get out of Europe either. So there's nowhere to go, but there are additional reasons to this. And one reason, and this really separates the Jewish experience in the Farhud, and why I say it can't be, it's not comparable to kind of the European Jewish experience in this period, is that an official government commission is set up to look into the events of the Farhud. And military courts are set up, and the perpetrators and criminals are punished. And this is framed by the state as being a stain on Iraqi history, a stain on the spirit of pluralism within the Iraqi Jewish experience. And there is some indemnification for the looting which occurred. It's not commensurate with the damage that Jewish businesses and homes experienced, but there is indemnification. And so the government, one, takes over, it reasserts power, and the first thing they do is they say a crime has been committed against the Jewish community. This is diametrically different than after Kristallnacht, for example, in Germany, right? So that also assuages some of the concerns of the Jewish community. Of course, I can't put myself in the position of what it was like to be a Jew at the end of June in 1941 in Baghdad. But these acts, plus the fact that the British have come back in, there's greater order in the city, and Baghdad and Basra become important way stations in World War II, and the economy improves, the position of Jews will improve in Iraq post-Farhud. So when we talk about the Farhud as being the beginning of the end for Iraqi Jewry, that's not really the case. And we can also see this in the as an example, in that the community continues to build schools and synagogues. So they very much viewed themselves as having a future in Iraq for many years after the Farhud. So then, of course, the question is, well, what happens? I argue, and many other scholars of Iraqi Jewry argue, that the Farhud is not the beginning of the end. But certainly this is a case where the creation of the state of Israel complicates the position of Jews in Iraq, and in a context where there is political and economic insecurity, will make life eventually untenable for the Jewish community of Iraq. And this is not a simple situation where it's the creation of Israel. It's also very much decisions that the Iraqi state made, which made life for Jews impossible in Iraq. So in 1948, Iraq is placed under martial law, and Jews are prevented from leaving the country. This is very important because an important sector of the Jewish population is a merchant class, and if they can't travel and import and export goods, they're financially paralyzed, right? Similarly, another important demographic of this community are civil servants. Many of them are dismissed from their positions because there's a paranoia surrounding Zionism, and quotas are placed on university students. Merchants can't get their trade licenses. And so all of these things together mean that the economic life becomes untenable for the Jewish community, coupled with political instability. When the government will eventually develop a plan where more or less they say that the Jewish population can leave, but they will be denaturalized and they must leave the majority of their wealth in Iraq. In the period between 49 and 52, 123,000 Iraqis leave. And we don't know 100% why this happened so quickly. And there is some archival evidence that shows that the government didn't think the community would be uprooted so quickly. But my interpretation is kind of twofold. One is that the Jewish community was highly connected to global Jewry, and with the rise of Arab nationalism and this looking inward on the region, it was very difficult for the community to function as such. And financially, the community was dependent both on remittances from the global Baghdadi diaspora, but also if people don't have their jobs in the civil service, if merchants can't acquire goods, the community can't function. So if the middle class leaves, then all of the charities fall apart, and then the lower classes will also have to leave. The majority of Iraqi Jews have no choice about where to go. A small amount, kind of the wealthy elite, will go to London. Some people will go to Tehran, but the vast majority will settle in Israel. And today, the majority of the grandchildren, let's say, or children of these Iraqi Jews who left, reside in Israel, because that was the only place they could go to in this period between 49 and 52. And of course, you need to remember, I mean, Europe is still being rebuilt in this period. The United States is not a viable place of migration. So just to kind of summarize, the factors of migration are very complicated. They're related to kind of this slow period of decolonization in Iraq. Certainly Zionism plays a part, the rise of a more exclusive Arab nationalism, political instability, and economic instability. Some of these things play a part in the Farhud, but we can't necessarily draw a close connection between these two events. So just a couple of quick conclusions, and then I'm happy to answer your questions. We can't forget in this story that Jews really do help build the modern Middle East in different ways, but this is true across the region. And if we look at the Farhud as an example, it's not comparable to Kristallnacht or other Jewish violence in Europe during the Shoah. Jewish life in Iraq is ultimately upended due to multiple factors. It's a complex process, which is not, I would say, fully understood today. But my personal pitch is that we really need to elevate knowledge about the history and culture of Middle Eastern and North African Jewry if we want to understand modern Jewish history and even the contemporary Jewish experience. So I will stop there. Thank you for listening to me, and I'm happy to answer your questions.
Thank you, Sasha. I'm gonna take chair's right, if that's okay, and ask a question first. And it kind of links to what you mentioned at the end anyway. But is the Jewish history of Iraq taught in Iraqi schools, or is it sort of a hidden, lesser known story of Iraq?
So that's a really complicated question. The current state in Iraq is very divided. Obviously, what students learn in Kurdistan is different than Baghdad. It's also divided between Sunni and Shiite communities. So I would say overwhelmingly, it's relatively limited what is taught. However, there are certain Jewish notables in Iraqi history who children do learn about. And the main example is Sassoon Haskell, and he is the Minister of Finance. And he's very respected in Iraqi history. He's the one who demands that the British remunerate the Iraqi state in gold, not in pounds, for oil revenues. He also writes all of the pension codes in Iraq, some of which are still on the books to this day. So you do have some notables. Also, although it's not taught, the culture is still present a little bit, although it's not necessarily attributed to Jews. And so that's, for example, the music of the Kuwaiti brothers is still played on the radios as old music. But there is a distancing from the importance of Jews in the national curriculum, which I think is a shame. There are scholars in Iraq, though, who do work on Iraqi Jewish history, and I think try to elevate it. But the political situation in Iraq is very difficult right now as well, and complicated.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've had a few comments and also a question about the role of the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem and his role within the Farhud, and how he sort of seemed to agitate anti-Jewish feeling as well.
That's a good question. So I think there's little compelling evidence, right? The Mufti of Jerusalem is in contact with kind of some of the supporters of Rashid Ali, but we certainly don't have so much reliable archival material. So could there have been something? Possibly, but we just don't know. I'm just reading the question here. Can the Library trust in Farhud, the current Middle East conflict? I don't think the experience of the Farhud really parallels anything contemporary either. I will say, I think it is important to understand that the Jews are very much put up as kind of the signifiers of the class which supports the British, and this is seen as an anti-colonial riot in 1941 with tragic, horrible consequences. But it's a different context.
We've got a question from Rob. So in Rob's research, he hasn't found much coverage of the Farhud in the Jewish Chronicle, in their archives, in the editions from summer 1941. Is this the case? And if so, why was there so little focus on the Farhud?
That's a really good question. It's been quite some time that I actually looked into these archives. A lot's going on in 1941. I think you need to contextualize where the Jewish world is in this period and what's going on. But I do know that there are some brief mentions of the Farhud. And certainly, so now I'm not talking about the Jewish Chronicle, but I'm talking about Jewish philanthropic organizations. And for example, the JDC, the Joint Distribution Committee, and also the Anglo-Jewish. And there are discussions about what is happening in Iraq and how much attention needs to be given to Iraq. And there's correspondence between the Jewish communal leadership in Iraq with these Jewish organizations. And most of what happens is that it's decided that more attention needs to be given to European Jewry and less to Iraqi Jewry, because although their position is far from ideal, it's still better than European Jewry. And ultimately, I mean, you'll see this in that when you look at the Shanghai ghetto, Iraqi Jewry are really central to supporting the Shanghai ghetto. So that kind of shows how this risk assessment is done.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'd not realised that we have a few collections in our archive of people going to Shanghai and then eventually making it to the north of England. But I'd not heard about that connection before.
Yeah, so because the older Jewish community in Shanghai is a Baghdadi community, and it's part of this Baghdadi trade network that I'd mentioned before. So actually, so if you look at kind of communal archives, you'll see even correspondence between Baghdad and Shanghai about how the Shanghai community is coping with trying to address the needs of the Shanghai ghetto as it grows.
So we've got a question from Fatima. What do you think of Avi Shlaim? Sorry, I probably butchered that pronunciation. I know many anti-Zionists use him as an authority figure and blame only Israel for Jews leaving Iraq. Equally, some secular Jews, the question's gone, blame Israel. Why do you think they say / believe this?
Okay, so I know Avi. He's come to my talks. We have very friendly relations. Here's what I'll say. Avi has one very personal story, right? He left Iraq at a very, very young age and really grew up in Ramat Gan and then in London. And I think he sometimes has internalized some of his experiences into wider tropes about Iraqi history. But those are kind of different, right? And I think we need to be very careful to reformulate the experiences of Iraqi Jews in 1947 and 1948 in a contemporary context. And if we want to understand wider trends within Iraqi Jewish history, we need to take an aggregate kind of analysis of different oral histories, of different archival materials, and also, different social classes. And so I think Avi's personal history now, I'm not talking about, he has scholarship and then he has his new biography that's come out. I don't think weaving a personal biography with a larger history is always useful in an academic setting. And I do think it's categorically irresponsible to blame the state of Israel for the exodus of Iraqi Jews. The Iraqi state made decisions. Some of these decisions were based on the existence of the state of Israel, but ultimately it's the Iraqi state that made life for Jews untenable in Iraq.
Thank you. Gail, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Sorry, I've just lost my screen. Thank you, Sasha, that was very interesting. I don't
You cut.
know very much about the Jews of Iraq and their history. I was very struck by that period of time in, I think it was the late 20s, when there was a switch away from, I can't remember what you said now, but it was something about a switch away from using Jewish Iraqi language, Hebrew, whatever it might have been, into modern Arabic.
Mm-hmm.
And I was reminded of something that happened, I think, in South Africa in the Jewish population at around a similar-ish decade, not sure, where there was a choice that the Jewish community either were given an ultimatum between the Afrikaans and English-speaking communities or whether it was a choice that they created for themselves. I don't think so. And they basically had to decide which other community to become incorporated into. I just wondered what other thoughts you had about that moment, because in a way, that assimilation, is it enforced? Was it chosen?
Okay, so that's a really good question.
Just I wondered who was involved in making those decisions. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. So overall, from, again, my experience in the Iraqi Jewish archives, the communal leadership who kind of decides the policies of the community, they want to be part of the state. They want to be full citizens. But we need to think about this within the context of kind of the Islamic world. You're still part of a religious community. So marriage, death, divorce, inheritance, this is still done through rabbinical courts, for example, in this period, right? So but the idea that you can be Jewish and part of transnational Jewish networks, and then also part of the wider Iraqi society, that's not seen as problematic in this period. And that it is thought that to be part of this new society, not just speaking Arabic, but certainly reading Arabic script and writing in it so that your ideas can be read by a wider population is important. And so I would say that it's the openness of the Iraqi society, and the desire of the Jewish community, but there's one kind of additional aspect there, which is why the community doesn't fragment. It's still a recognized religious community. And so the religious leadership isn't challenged. You still have a chief rabbi. You still have to kind of play by the rules of being within the Jewish community unless you convert to Islam. Very few people convert to Islam. There are some examples. And so you don't have fracturing in the community. You have kind of a more organized transition. And so the schools teach Arabic. They also teach French or English. It kind of depends on which school. And they're really able to just be part of these multiple networks. And it's the 20s are, post-Ottoman, post-World War, I. They're really a time of tremendous optimism and enthusiasm and socioeconomic advancement. And then that is undermined by political and economic instability in the 30s, and then certainly World War II and decolonization and, Zionism leading up to the creation of the State of Israel. That all very much complicates the situation of Iraqi Jews. But as a historian, I always say it's a mosaic of different events, and you can't just kind of assign blame or say, one person or one event is responsible for everything. It's just not possible.
Thank you. I think Ronnie would like to unmute and say a few comments.
I can't hear you.
Yeah, sorry. Sasha, many thanks for your talk and explanation, but I need to put my cards on the table. I'm an Iraqi Jew, born in Iraq and didn't leave Iraq until 1971. So much of what you said about the history is very much what my formative experience is. I think you touched on many good points, but you missed out on few important issues. Haj Amin of Mufti of Jerusalem played a very active part, because in the 1930s, post King Faisal I, who passed away, his son King Ghazi was very much a nationalist Arabic who promoted nationalist policies and feelings. And some of this nationalist attitude were encouraged by the German ambassador in Iraq. And there were very much anti-Jewish policies and attitudes. By policies, I mean, politicians saying things, not enacting laws, but attitude and things like that. And the quartet of the 4 generals who took over the government post beginning of the Second World War were supported and encouraged by the Mufti of Jerusalem. And the Mufti of Jerusalem, let's put it in context, is the uncle of Arafat. So he very much agitated the German did try and intercede between the fighting that broke out between the Iraqi army and the English army that came in from the west of Iraq, Habaniya, where the British had an airfield center in there, but the German planes didn't reach in time, and the English managed to defeat the Iraqi army. What has happened is a breakdown and complete flow in Baghdad for 2 days.
For sure.
Some of the looters and the killing were done even by police people. Right?
Yeah,
and there was.
I said it was the police.
No, I'm just saying. I'm just giving you the background where all of these things happening. So a lot of the things that has happened is because there was no government.
Right. Yeah.
Like completely no government. The sad part of it is it took place on the first day of Shavuot, and typical Iraqi Jewish Shavuot is an important holiday. So they went out dressed up in the nice clothes, and some of the Muslims or the community thought that the Jews are celebrating the defeat of the Iraqi army. So that actually agitated and encouraged attacks on the Jewish community. But as far as I'm concerned, as far as I'm aware, what my parents told me, the Farhud was the beginning of the end, because post the Farhud, a lot of the Jewish young teenagers, early 20s, formed defense communities and were trained in arms and trained how to handle arms and defend themselves, because it's never again going to happen to the Jewish community. And some of that training came from the Jews in Palestine at the time, or the Haganah, thing like that. And what has been always referred to my mother, which she refers to is Nu'ah, which is organization.
Yeah.
And that also actually encouraged the smuggling of the Jews out of Iraq, either via Jordan to Palestine mandate or via Iran to the Palestine. The reason why many Jews decided to leave Iraq in the post-1948, 49, probably also to do with the fact that the Iraqi government, after the defeat in the war they launched against Israel, turned around and trying to blame who was responsible for the defeat of the Iraqi army. They picked on a wealthy Jewish merchant, Adas, who lived in Baghdad, in Basra, who used to deal in scrap metal, and they accused him of exporting military equipment to Israel, and that was what caused the defeat of the Iraqi army. It was a sham court, and they sentenced him to be hanged. They built the equipment to hang him in front of his house and hanged him in front of his own house. And that shocked the Jews to the core. And that was the impetus for leaving Iraq, and many Jews registered. At the same time, post that, there were quite a few Iraqi Jews who came from Israel to organize and encourage the immigration. And there was also violent attacks, like hand grenades were thrown at synagogues in Iraq. All these things happened more or less at the same time. You can't say one led to the other, or the other led to the, So all these things happening, but the Farhud was the impetus, gave that impetus for the Iraqi Jews to realize there is no future in Iraq.
So I think we're going to have to agree to disagree on the Farhud, but I do want to explain a little bit why I disagree. Post Farhud, you definitely have Jewish groups which organize themselves. This is well documented. Afterwards, Ehud Sereni, So he's the Zionist kind of envoy with Solel Boneh in Iraq. He's not very successful if you read kind of his documents and how things go and people who come after him. Iraqi Jews, for the most part, are not so interested in going to Mandate Palestine. You have a small group. But actually, after the Farhud, if we read the communal correspondence in the archives, we see that people are fighting and they don't agree what the future is. And so some people, but it's still like a small group of the youth at this point. It's very small, according to the archives. And I'm really basing this on my research or Reed Bashkin's research, but also Esther Meyer-Glitzenstein's incredible research on Zionism in Iraq. It's just not that big, but also it doesn't follow the pattern in terms of communal investment. In 42, 43, 44, 45, they're building schools and new synagogues. They're really investing in the community. And so both the archives which exist like online, if you look at the Iraqi Jewish archives, which are a little bit difficult to navigate, but certainly like the Kaduri and Sassoon archives that deal with their trusts and the money going into Iraq, we don't see the pivot in terms of funds and if funds are going to take people out until 48.
I would agree with that, and I agree with that your point. When I say it's the beginning of the end, it's the first time that the Jewish community in Iraq faced such an onslaught, a violent onslaught.
Right. Well,
what also pushed the thing is when the Iraqi government turned on the wealthiest, probably the most notable Iraqi Jew, and the way they conducted the Sham
with Adas. Yeah, but that's, I mean, that's significantly later.
Yeah.
I mean, Adas is significantly later, and I do think Adas, who is one person, and there's a lot to cover in a short period of time, I think he really does scare the community for sure. But I don't draw the parallel necessarily between Adas and the Farhud. Similarly, no, the Farhud is a buildup, right? In 1930s, there is discomfort, there is a certain erosion of security. Afterwards, the link, I mean, obviously the Mufti of Jerusalem is present, but again, I base it on archival research. That's just where it comes from. The Germans are less interested in Jews in Iraq. If you look at Groba and his correspondence with which Orit Bashkin has really gone into, it's just not as significant. So it's there, but that's not kind of what the correspondence and the analysis of Iraqi scholars leads to right now, but maybe it's not all there in the archives, but I think it's time. So Hannah, I put it back to you.
I can just one more thing and I'll let you go. In answer to Gail, she raised about the change in the language. I remember my grandmother corresponding with my aunt as late as the early 1960s in the Judeo-Arabic written in special Hebrew characters, all right? And I suspect the change in the 1920s away from that type of writing, but this remained with the older generation, is the prevalence of the secular education, which meant less religious education, less use of the fonts and the characters, which is based on Aramaic, Hebrew to Arabic, okay? One final comment is I was intrigued about today's date. Why they let, what, is it coincidence or something? 5th of June was the end of the Iraqi community in Baghdad and Iraq. On 5th of June, the Six-Day War started, and that was the end of any semblance of us staying in Iraq, because we knew we were not welcomed in there. There was a lot of prosecution, culminated in 9 Iraqi Jews hanged in 1969, again publicly, on an excuse that they are spies for Israel. So to me, 1st of June was the beginning of the end, and 5th of June was the end of everything.
Thank you, Ronnie. It's actually a coincidence we chose this date because it was near to the anniversary of the Farhud. But yeah, also a coincidence. I will draw it together because I'm very aware of time. But I want to thank everyone for their comments and their questions. And Ronnie, thank you for putting in your own family history. It's really important that we heard that as well. And obviously, thank you, Sasha, for the wonderful talk this evening. So this is our last academic event of the academic year. But we're in the planning stages of next year, so please follow our social media and our newsletter to see what events we've got coming up in the next year. But we still have a lot of events going on at the centre in Huddersfield. So again, check our website for all those details. As I said at the beginning, we will send out the recording and a short survey. It'll be early next week because I'm actually on leave, so I won't be doing that tomorrow. But we will send it next week. So if anyone wants to rewatch, send it to colleagues, family, friends, etc. You will be able to. So once again, I just want to say thank you so much to Sasha for joining us, and for everybody else, good night. Thank you.